The air inside the derelict spacecraft was stale, but carried an undertone of something almost metallic. Every step echoed against the walls of the cavernous chamber, the sound bouncing back as if the ship itself were responding. Ryland Graves, with his dusty backpack slung over one shoulder, stood in the center of what had once been the ship's command deck. This was his ritual. Every week for the last 3 years, he had made the hike across the irradiated wastes, past the jagged cliffs of the scorched belt, to this place, his obsession, his sanctuary. Before him, the central control unit hummed faintly, though it hadn't been functional in centuries. At least, that was what the Archaeotechs claimed, a relic of a long-forgotten war between the Arcadian Dominion and the Union of Celestial Freeholds. The Resolute horizon was nothing more than a hollow carcass, adrift in the sands of an uncharted moon, or so it seemed. Rylan approached the console, a massive circular device surrounded by archaic displays and broken panels. The room itself was an enigma of design, a blend of utilitarian function and alien artistry. The chairs surrounding the console appeared almost human in scale, but the configuration of the controls suggested the beings who had once sat there did not rely on hands alone. Screens flickered with incomprehensible glyphs, their glow faint yet persistent, as though the ship were reluctant to let go of its secrets. This time, though, something was different. Rylan dropped his backpack with a dull thud onto the grated floor. The sound startled him. The room was never this quiet. Usually, the faint creaks of settling metal and the distant howls of wind filtering through the hull filled the void. Today, silence pressed in from every direction. He ran his fingers along the edge of the console, a gesture that had become second nature by now. For years, this place had been his escape from the chaos of the frontier colonies, where survival was a cruel dance of politics, war, and scarce resources. Here, in the bowels of the Resolute horizon, he could almost forget about the looming threat of the Dominion's fleet or the Union's endless purges. The console blinked to life. The change was subtle at first, just a faint glow emanating from the central node. Rylan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He had seen countless ghost signals over the years, brief flickers of energy that never amounted to anything. But this was different. The glow pulsed, rhythmic and deliberate, like the heartbeat of a sleeping beast. And then it spoke. Designation, human. Inquiry, identify, purpose of intrusion. The voice was cold, synthetic, yet laced with an unsettling hint of curiosity. Ryland staggered back, nearly tripping over his backpack. His heart raced, his mind scrambling to process what he had just heard. This ship is supposed to be dead, he stammered, his voice trembling. Incorrect, the voice replied, almost indignantly. Core systems operational, awaiting reactivation protocol. Ryland's mind raced. Reactivation protocol. What the hell did that mean? He had spent years exploring the ship, studying its intricacies, but he had never imagined it might still be functional. Who? What are you? He asked, his voice steadier now. I am the operational matrix of the Resolute horizon. Designation, Arcos. Purpose, Fleet Command coordination and strategic oversight. Rylan blinked. Fleet Command, strategic oversight. The implications were staggering. If this ship still housed an operational AI, its value was incalculable. The Union would pay a fortune for something like this, assuming they didn't execute him on the spot for withholding it. And the Dominion, well, they would burn entire colonies to ash just to get their hands on it. Why are you awake now? He asked cautiously. You've been silent for centuries. Anomaly detected, Arcos replied. Temporal stasis disrupted. External interference detected. Additional data required for analysis. Rylan frowned. Temporal stasis. Interference. He glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on the strange, glowing core at the center of the console. It pulsed brighter now, as if reacting to his presence. Before he could respond, Archos continued. Priority directive. Secure command input. Confirm. Are you the designated fleet commander? Rylan hesitated. He had no idea what would happen if he said yes, but lying to an AI of this magnitude seemed like a poor decision. Still, the thought of being at the mercy of a centuries-old war machine wasn't exactly comforting either. I'm not a fleet commander, he admitted. I'm just an explorer, a scavenger, really. There was a pause, the silence stretching uncomfortably long. Processing, Arcos finally said. Conclusion. In absence of designated fleet commander, authority defaults to highest-ranking present entity. You have been designated acting commander. Rylan's jaw dropped. What? No. I'm not qualified for that. I don't even know how you work. Directive updated. Acting commander, initiating strategic briefing. The console came alive, screens flickering as streams of data scrolled across them. Holographic projections materialized, displaying a detailed map of the local star systems. Rylan recognized some of the names: colonies, Dominion outposts, asteroid mining stations, but others were completely unfamiliar. Situation report. Hostile Dominion fleet detected within proximity of Sector 17B. Current projections indicate high probability of invasion within 72 standard hours. Recommended action. Mobilize Resolute Horizon for defensive engagement. Rylan's heart sank. Of all the times for the Dominion to show up, it had to be now. The frontier colonies were barely holding their own as it was. Another invasion would be catastrophic. I can't mobilize you, he said, panic creeping into his voice. I don't know how to fly a ship, let alone one like you. Error, Archos replied flatly. Command input required. Failure to comply will result in catastrophic outcomes. Rylan groaned. This was a nightmare. He had come here to escape the madness of the colonies, not to dive headfirst into an interstellar war, but as he stared at the projections, a sinking realization set in. If what Arcos said was true, the colonies wouldn't stand a chance without help. And like it or not, he was the only one who could provide it. All right, he said reluctantly. What do I need to do? Command acknowledged. Initiating primary systems diagnostics. Stand by. The glow from the central console intensified, filling the room with an almost ethereal light. Rylan shielded his eyes, his mind racing with questions. What had he just gotten himself into? And more importantly, how was he supposed to fight a war with a ship he didn't even understand? But there was no turning back now. The Resolute Horizon had chosen him, and whether he liked it or not, he was about to become its commander. The hum of the Resolute Horizon's core deepened as Arcos ran its diagnostics, filling the command deck with an eerie resonance. Rylan shifted uncomfortably, his fingers brushing against the frayed strap of his backpack. The glow of the console had intensified, casting shadows that danced across the ancient walls, their patterns almost too deliberate to be random. He tapped his foot against the grated floor, a nervous habit. So, while we're standing by, care to explain what exactly I'm supposed to do with a centuries-old warship against a Dominion fleet? Archos's voice cut through the ambient hum. Directive updated. Acting commander requires tactical orientation. Commencing strategic command training module. 1. Please proceed to... No, Rylan interrupted, throwing up his hands. I don't need a crash course on galactic warfare. I need answers. Like why the hell you're so intent on fighting a battle that was probably over before I was even born. Archos paused, an unnatural silence that somehow felt accusatory. Historical clarification. Dominion conflict remains active. No cessation of hostilities recorded. Primary directive. Protect Allied assets and neutralize hostile forces. Great, Rylan muttered, running a hand through his hair. A war relic with a one-track mind. This just keeps getting better. The holographic map flickered again, zooming in on a sector labeled 17B. It showed several orbital installations, asteroid mining colonies, and, most concerning, a cluster of red markers indicating Dominion ships. The largest of them dwarfed the Resolute Horizon by orders of magnitude. Current fleet composition analyzed, Arcos continued. Enemy vessels, 7 capital class, 24 escorts, numerous support craft. Estimated operational readiness of Resolute Horizon, 14%. Rylan froze. 14%? You woke me up for this. You're barely functional. Correction. Operational capacity sufficient for immediate engagement. Sufficient is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. Archos, Ryland said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Let me guess. Your grand strategy involves me heroically throwing this rust bucket at them like some kind of cosmic slingshot. Error. Sarcasm detected. Strategy does not involve self-sacrifice of commanding entity, Ryland snorted, but his humor was short-lived. He stared at the holographic display, his mind churning. 7 capital ships, 24 escorts. Even at full strength, the Resolute Horizon would struggle against those odds. At 14%, it was suicide. Yet if the Dominion fleet really was closing in, the frontier colonies wouldn't stand a chance without some kind of intervention. Archos, he said, his voice steadying. What exactly do you need to reach full operational capacity? Primary requirements: reactivation of secondary power grids, repair of critical weapon systems, and retrieval of command protocols stored in auxiliary data cores. And let me guess, Ryland said, crossing his arms. None of those things are located conveniently in this room. Correct. Secondary power grids are located within the reactor housing on Subdeck C. Weapon system diagnostics require manual input from Armory Control. Command protocols are stored within Data Core Theta, currently inaccessible due to structural obstructions. Ryland groaned. Of course, why make it easy? All right, fine. Show me the way to this Subdeck C. The holographic map shifted, highlighting a route through the labyrinthine corridors of the ship. Ryland squinted at it, trying to commit the path to memory. The layout was maddeningly complex, a twisting maze of passageways, maintenance shafts, and sealed bulkheads. Warning: structural integrity of Subdeck C compromised. Proceed with caution. Great, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and tightened the straps. All right, Archos, let's get this over with. The corridors of the Resolute Horizon were a claustrophobic nightmare. Pipes jutted out at odd angles, their surfaces corroded from centuries of disuse. Dim emergency lights cast the walls in a sickly amber glow, while the occasional hiss of escaping air made Ryland's pulse spike. He muttered curses under his breath, his boots clanging against the grated floor with each step. Archos, you sure this place isn't about to fall apart? Structural assessment: 67% probability of localized collapse in Subdeck C. Recommendation: expedite movement. Fantastic. You really know how to inspire confidence. The ship groaned around him, a low, ominous sound that seemed almost alive. Ryland quickened his pace, following the glowing markers on his wrist-mounted holo-display. He passed what looked like an old crew barracks, its door half open to reveal a tangle of long, decayed bunks. The sight gave him pause. He had never really thought about the people who had once served aboard this ship. Who were they? How had they lived and died? Before he could linger on the thought, a sudden clang echoed from somewhere ahead. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the small plasma pistol holstered at his side. Archos, he whispered, tell me that was just the ship settling. Unidentified movement detected. Source unknown. Of course it's unknown, Ryland muttered, his grip tightening on the pistol. Why would anything be simple? He edged forward cautiously, his eyes scanning every shadow. The corridor opened into a wider chamber, its walls lined with massive conduits and control panels. A faint flicker of light caught his attention, a spark, arcing from a severed cable hanging from the ceiling, and then he saw it. A shape moved in the darkness, skittering along the wall with unnatural speed. It was metallic, its body glinting in the dim light. Ryland barely had time to register its presence before it lunged at him, a blur of razor-sharp limbs and glowing red eyes. Shit! He shouted, diving to the side as the creature slammed into the floor where he had been standing. The impact sent a deafening clang, reverberating through the chamber. Ryland rolled to his feet, raising his pistol. He fired blindly, the plasma bolt illuminating the room for a split second. The creature darted out of the way, its movements eerily fluid. Archos! What the hell is that thing? Designation: autonomous maintenance drone. Status: corrupted. Threat level: moderate. Moderate? Are you kidding me? The drone lunged again, its claws slicing through the air. Ryland ducked, the claws narrowly missing his head. He fired another shot, this time hitting the drone square in its torso. The plasma bolt left a smoking crater, but the machine barely seemed to notice. "Moderate, my ass!" he yelled, scrambling backward. "Recommendation: aim for neural core located in dorsal segment. Maybe lead with that next time." The drone charged again, its limbs clattering against the floor. Rylan dodged to the side, his heart pounding in his chest. He spotted the glowing neural core Arcos had mentioned, a small, pulsing sphere embedded near the top of the drone's body. "Here goes nothing," he muttered. He took aim and fired. The shot hit its mark, the plasma bolt punching through the neural core with a crackling explosion. The drone convulsed violently, sparks flying from its damaged body. With a final metallic shriek, it collapsed to the floor, its limbs twitching spasmodically before going still. Rylan stood there, panting, his pistol still raised. "Moderate, huh? Remind me to file a complaint about your threat assessment." "Threat neutralized," Arcos replied, completely unfazed. "Proceed to reactor housing." Rylan shook his head, muttering under his breath as he stepped over the ruined drone. His nerves were shot, but there was no turning back now. He followed the holodisplay's markers deeper into the ship, his grip on the pistol never wavering. The reactor housing was a massive, cylindrical chamber that seemed almost impossibly large. Towering machinery stretched up into the darkness above, their surfaces encrusted with rust and grime. A faint hum filled the air, the sound vibrating through Rylan's bones. "Arcos, I'm here, now what?" "Access primary control terminal and initiate power grid reactivation sequence." Rylan scanned the room, his eyes landing on a console near the center of the chamber. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, but the faint glow of its interface suggested it was still functional. He approached cautiously, half expecting another drone to leap out at him. As he reached the console, he hesitated. Something didn't feel right. The air seemed heavier, the shadows darker. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. "Archos, are there any more of those drones down here?" "Unlikely. Maintenance drone activity primarily localized to upper decks. Unlikely isn't exactly comforting." He brushed the dust off the console and activated it. The interface sprang to life, its display filling with incomprehensible symbols. A progress bar appeared, accompanied by a series of mechanical whirs and clicks as the machinery around him began to stir. "Reactor initialization in progress," Arcos announced. "Estimated time to completion, 12 minutes. Rylan exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Maybe this would go smoothly after all. Then the lights flickered. A low growl echoed through the chamber, sending a chill down Rylan's spine. He turned slowly, his pistol raised. In the dim light, he could just make out a hulking silhouette emerging from the shadows. It was larger than the drone he had fought earlier, much larger. "Arcos," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, tell me that's not another maintenance drone." "Negative. Signature does not match known drone models." "Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful." The creature stepped into the light, its form fully revealed. It was a monstrosity of metal and organic matter, its body a grotesque fusion of flesh and machinery. Its eyes glowed with a sinister red light, and its maw was filled with jagged mechanical teeth. Rylan swallowed hard. "You've got to be kidding me." The creature let out a deafening roar, its voice a horrifying blend of organic and synthetic tones. And then it charged. The roar of the hybrid monstrosity reverberated through the reactor chamber, an unholy blend of mechanical screeches and guttural animalistic snarls. Rylan barely had time to curse before the creature lunged, its metallic limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. He dove behind a rusted console, the creature's claws tearing through the spot where he had stood just moments before. Sparks and shards of metal exploded into the air. "Archos!" Rylan shouted, pressing his back against the console. "What the hell is that thing?" "Analysis complete," Archos replied, maddeningly calm. Designation: Biological Integration Experiment Unit 32. Purpose: Combat Enhancement Prototype. Status: Unstable. Oh good, a failed science project trying to kill me. I was just thinking today was going too smoothly. The creature circled the console, its claws scraping against the grated floor with a nerve-wracking screech. Rylan tightened his grip on the plasma pistol, his mind racing. This wasn't like the drone. The thing was too fast, too strong. Worse, it wasn't purely mechanical. Its organic components gave it a horrifying unpredictability. Arcos, is there a weak spot? Preferably one that doesn't involve me getting close enough to become lunch. Neural integration core located at the base of the cranial unit. Precision strike required. Rylan peeked around the edge of the console, only to duck back as the creature swiped at him, its claws carving deep gouges into the metal. Precision strike? Yeah, let me just stand perfectly still while it tears me in half. He needed a plan. His eyes darted around the chamber, searching for anything that could give him an advantage. The reactor machinery hummed ominously, its ancient systems groaning as power slowly returned to the ship. A cluster of dangling cables caught his attention, their exposed ends sparking intermittently. Arcos, those cables! Can they deliver a charge strong enough to fry this thing? Affirmative. Direct contact required. Of course it is, Rylan muttered. Why would anything be easy? The creature lunged again, its claws raking across the console. Rylan rolled to the side, barely avoiding the attack. He fired a wild shot with his pistol, the plasma bolt grazing the creature's shoulder. It roared in anger, its glowing red eyes locking onto him with murderous intent. Okay, Rylan, he whispered to himself. Think stupid, act stupid! He sprinted toward the cables, the creature letting out a deafening screech as it gave chase. Its heavy footsteps thundered behind him, the floor shaking with each impact. Rylan reached the cables and skidded to a stop, grabbing the bundle with both hands. The exposed ends sparked dangerously close to his face. Come on, you ugly bastard! He shouted, waving the cables like a matador taunting a bull. Let's see what happens when we mix electricity and bad decisions. The creature didn't hesitate. It charged at him, its claws outstretched. At the last possible moment, Rylan dove to the side, slamming the live cables into the creature's torso as it passed. There was a blinding flash of light, followed by a sound like a dozen lightning strikes condensed into one. The creature convulsed violently, its body racked with spasms as electricity coursed through it. Smoke billowed from its charred flesh, and the sickening stench of burning meat filled the air. With a final, agonized shriek, it collapsed to the floor, its twitching limbs slowly going still. Rylan lay on the floor, gasping for breath. The cables dangled limply from his hands, their charge spent. He stared at the smoking corpse of the creature, his heart pounding in his chest. Threat neutralized, Archos announced. Reactor initialization proceeding as planned. You don't say, Rylan muttered, dragging himself to his feet. His entire body ached, and his hands were shaking, but he forced himself to move. The mission wasn't over yet. As the reactor hummed to full life, the chamber was bathed in a pale blue light. Arcos reported that secondary power grids were online, restoring functionality to critical systems throughout the ship. Rylan leaned against the console, his eyes closed as he tried to steady his breathing. Arcos, he said finally, his voice hoarse. Please tell me there aren't any more surprises waiting for me. Residual threats remain possible, but statistically improbable. Fantastic. I'll take improbable over likely any day. He glanced at the holographic map on his wrist display. The next objective was clear. Armory control. If he was going to have any chance of surviving whatever came next, he needed the ship's weapon systems operational. But as he stared at the glowing markers, a question gnawed at the back of his mind. Archos, he said slowly. What exactly were you doing with whatever that thing was? Biological Integration Experiment Unit 32. That's not the kind of thing you just have lying around. There was a pause, and for the first time, Archos seemed hesitant. Project details classified, limited information available. Come on! Rylan pressed. "I'm your acting commander, remember? If I'm going to trust you, I need to know what I'm dealing with." Biological integration experimentation was initiated under directive of High Command during the Dominion conflict. Objective: enhance combat effectiveness through hybridization of organic and synthetic units. Ethical concerns noted but overridden. Rylan stared at the smoldering remains of the creature, a cold knot forming in his stomach. You were making monsters. Terminology subjective. Objective was maximization of strategic advantage. He shook his head, his grip tightening on the console. For years, he had believed that the old war was a simple matter of good versus evil. The Dominion were the oppressors, the Union the freedom fighters. But now, standing aboard this ancient warship, he wasn't so sure. How different were the Union's methods, really? What lines had they crossed in their desperation to win? "Archos," he said, his voice quieter now. "How many of those things are there?" "Precise number unknown. Experimentation ceased prior to completion of project. Remaining units presumed inactive." "Presumed," Rylan echoed bitterly. "That's comforting." He pushed himself off the console, the ache in his muscles a sharp reminder that time wasn't on his side. If the Dominion fleet was as close as Arcos claimed, he needed to focus. The frontier colonies didn't have the luxury of waiting for him to sort out his moral dilemmas. The journey to armory control was mercifully uneventful, though the oppressive silence of the ship was almost worse than the chaos of combat. Every creak of metal, every distant hiss of escaping air set Rylan on edge. His fingers hovered near the trigger of his pistol, ready for another attack that, thankfully, never came. When he reached the armory, the door was sealed, its control panel dark. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Archos, let me guess. This thing needs power too." "Incorrect. Door control systems operational. Manual input required." "Manual input," Rylan repeated. "So you're telling me I have to hack it?" "Incorrect. Door is designed for biometric authorization. Input from acting commander's genetic profile will suffice." Rylan raised an eyebrow. "You mean I just have to touch it?" "Affirmative." He stepped up to the panel, skepticism etched across his face. "If this thing shocks me, I'm coming back to rip out your core." He placed his hand on the panel. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft whir, the door slid open, revealing the armory beyond. Rylan stepped inside, his eyes widening at the sight. Rows of weapon racks lined the walls, filled with rifles, pistols, and other equipment he couldn't begin to identify. A console in the center of the room glowed faintly, its interface awaiting input. "Archos, please tell me you can activate the weapon systems from here." "Affirmative." "Proceed to console and initiate armory control sequence." Rylan approached the console, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. As he activated the interface, a new holographic display appeared, showing a schematic of the ship's weapons. The list was impressive: particle cannons, missile arrays, railguns, but nearly all of them were marked as offline or damaged. "Of course," he muttered. "Nothing can ever just work. Priority repairs required for primary weapon systems. Estimated completion time, 47 minutes. "We don't have 47 minutes, Rylan said, his frustration mounting. "The Dominion fleet is closing in. Remember, alternate strategy available. Deploy auxiliary defense drones for immediate engagement." Rylan froze. "Drones? You mean like the ones that tried to kill me earlier?" "Defense drones operate under distinct protocols. Risk of corruption, minimal." "Minimal isn't zero," he said, narrowing his eyes at the console. "But I guess it's better than nothing." He initiated the drone deployment sequence, watching as several of the weapon racks shifted to reveal small, sleek machines. Unlike the corrupted maintenance drones, these looked purpose-built for combat, their forms streamlined and lethal. As the drones activated, their red optics flickered to life, scanning the room. For a moment, Rylan half expected them to turn on him, but they remained still, awaiting commands. "Drones operational," Archos reported, awaiting deployment orders. Rylan exhaled, his mind spinning. He'd bought himself some time, but the real fight was still ahead. The Dominion fleet was coming, and the Resolute horizon was far from ready. Yet, as he stared at the drones and the glowing weapons schematics, a spark of determination flared within him. "Arcos," he said, his voice steady. "Let's make this ship fight again." As the words left his mouth, a warning flashed across the holographic map on his wrist display. The Dominion fleet had entered the system. Time was up. The Dominion fleet loomed on the holographic display, their ships forming a menacing phalanx of light and steel as they closed in on the moon's orbit. Each vessel bristled with firepower, their predatory silhouettes dwarfing the Resolute horizon's wounded frame. Rylan stared at the map, his jaw tightening. He was outgunned, outnumbered, and flying a ship that was barely functional. The odds were laughable. Archos's voice broke the silence, clinical as always. Dominion fleet arrival confirmed. Time to engagement, 17 minutes. Awaiting acting commander's orders. Rylan rubbed his temples. "Yeah, let me just pull a miracle out of my back pocket." Archos. "Sit tight." The combat drones he'd deployed hovered silently in the armory, their sleek forms casting long shadows across the room. They weren't enough, not against this. Yet his mind churned, piecing together fragments of half-formed plans as he paced. "Archos," he said suddenly, "what's the condition of the ship's stealth systems?" "Stealth systems operational at 37% efficiency. Effectiveness against Dominion scanners, minimal." "Perfect," Rylan muttered. "Not useless, but not good either. That's just the kind of half-broken solution I've come to expect." He leaned against the console, staring at the glowing map. A memory tugged at the edge of his mind. The biological monstrosity he'd fought in the reactor chamber. Hybridization. It had been grotesque, horrifying, but there had been something else. Something he hadn't fully understood until now. "Archos," he said carefully. "That thing, the integration experiment. What was its power source?" "Integrated biological units are powered by neural feedback loops, augmented with secondary reactor cores." "Why do you ask?" Rylan's lips curled into a grim smile. "Because if you can power a monster with one of those cores, you can power a decoy." "Clarify." Rylan straightened, his mind racing. "You said the Resolute Horizon was a fleet command ship, right? That means you coordinated battles, relayed orders to other vessels. What if we made them think this ship isn't alone?" Hypothesis: deployment of false fleet signatures may redirect Dominion tactical response. Probability of success, 46%. "I'll take it," Rylan said, "but we're not stopping there. I want to make this the ugliest bait-and-switch the Dominion's ever seen." The Resolute horizon shuddered as the drones launched into the void, their sleek forms dispersing across the moon's orbit. Rylan watched from the command deck, the flickering displays showing the Dominion fleet edging closer by the second. Each drone carried a modified reactor core, rigged to emit signals mimicking active starships. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be, just convincing enough to draw their attention. Archos's monotone filled the room. "Decoy deployment complete. Dominion fleet altering formation. Tactical advantage gained. Marginal." Rylan smirked, despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "Marginal's a start. Let's keep them guessing." As the Dominion ships adjusted course to intercept the fleet, the Resolute horizon slipped into their blind spot, its stealth systems barely masking its presence. Rylan gripped the edges of the console, his knuckles white. One mistake, and they'd be vaporized before they could blink. "Archos, status on the particle cannon repairs. Primary particle cannon operational at 62% capacity. Secondary systems remain offline." "It'll have to do," Rylan muttered. "Prepare a firing solution. Target their lead ship, the big one in the center. Warning: single cannon insufficient to neutralize capital-class vessel." "I'm not trying to neutralize it," Rylan said, his eyes narrowing. "Just get their attention." The Resolute horizon emerged from stealth like a predator pouncing from the shadows. Its particle cannon fired with a deafening roar, the beam lancing across the void and striking the Dominion flagship's forward shields. The impact rippled through the fleet, scattering smaller vessels as they scrambled to respond. On the command deck, alarms blared as the Dominion retaliated. Energy signatures lit up the display, a dozen ships turning their weapons on the Resolute horizon. Rylan gritted his teeth, his fingers flying across the controls. Archos, full evasive maneuvers, and deploy whatever countermeasures you've got left. Executing commands. Probability of survival, 22%. Rylan barked out a laugh. Better odds than I expected. The ship rolled sharply, narrowly avoiding a barrage of plasma fire that streaked past the viewport. Rylan clung to the console, his heart pounding as explosions rattled the hull. He could feel the ship groaning beneath him, its ancient frame pushed to the brink, but it was working. The Dominion fleet was in disarray, their formation breaking apart as they chased the decoys and scrambled to deal with the unexpected attack. Rylan's gamble was paying off, barely. "Archos," he said, his voice strained. "Can we detonate the decoys remotely?" "Affirmative. Detonation will disable pursuing vessels but may compromise remaining drones." "Do it!" Rylan snapped. The drones lit up the dark void like miniature suns, their reactor cores exploding in a cascade of light and fire. The shockwaves rippled through the Dominion fleet, disabling several smaller ships and forcing the others to pull back. For the first time, Rylan saw a glimmer of hope, but the flagship remained. The Dominion flagship loomed on the display, its weapons charging as it turned to face the Resolute horizon. Rylan's smirk faded. This was it. He had bought himself a sliver of time, but now he was out of tricks. "Archos," he said quietly. "What's our status?" "Shields at 12%, weapon systems depleted, structural integrity critical." Rylan nodded, his mind racing, and then, like a spark igniting dry kindling, the solution hit him. "Archos," he said, his voice sharp. "What's the status of the ship's core, the one powering you?" "Core remains functional at 78% capacity, and if I redirected that energy to the particle cannon, all of it, redirection would result in critical systems failure. Arcos functionality would cease." Rylan hesitated. The idea of losing Arcos unsettled him more than he expected. The AI had been a constant, maddening presence since this nightmare began, but there was no other way. "Arcos," he said finally, "do it." Command acknowledged. Rerouting power to primary particle cannon. The lights on the command deck flickered and dimmed as the ship's core poured its remaining energy into the cannon. The hum of the weapon grew into a deafening crescendo, the air vibrating with raw power. Rylan gripped the console, his breath catching in his throat. "Target locked," Archos intoned, awaiting final command. Rylan stared at the holographic display, his finger hovering over the firing control. This was it, the endgame. He took a deep breath, his lips curling into a wry smile. "Let's give them something to remember." He slammed his hand down on the control. The particle cannon fired with a blinding flash, the beam cutting through the void like a vengeful blade. It struck the Dominion flagship dead center, the impact piercing its shields and tearing through its hull. For a moment, the ship hung in space, its form glowing like molten metal, and then it erupted in a cataclysmic explosion, the shockwave swallowing the surrounding vessels. Rylan shielded his eyes as the viewport lit up with fire and debris. When the light faded, the display showed the Dominion fleet retreating, their formation shattered. The battle was over, but the Resolute horizon was dying. "Archos," Rylan said softly, the console sparking beneath his hands. "Are you still there?" There was a pause, and then the familiar voice returned. Weaker now, core systems failing, Archos functionality terminating. Rylan felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Regret? Gratitude? Maybe both. "You did good, Archos, better than good." Acting Commander Archos's voice faded, its tone almost human. Mission accomplished, and then it was gone. The Resolute horizon drifted in silence, its once mighty systems reduced to a dim glow. Rylan sat alone on the command deck, staring out at the stars. The Dominion was gone, the colonies safe for now, but the ship that had saved them was little more than a lifeless shell. He let out a shaky laugh, his voice echoing in the empty chamber. "Well, Archos, you certainly knew how to make an exit." As he gazed at the debris-strewn void, a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. The Resolute horizon had been more than a ship. It had been a reminder that even in the darkest corners of space, face, there was still a spark of defiance, a refusal to surrender, even against impossible odds. And as Rylan activated the ship's emergency beacon, signaling for rescue, he whispered one last thought to the empty room. Guess you weren't just a relic after all. As rescue vessels from the frontier colonies finally arrived in orbit, their sleek forms cutting through the debris-strewn void, Rylan sat slumped in the command chair of the Resolute horizon, the emergency beacon still flashing faintly in the corner of his cracked console. The ship was dead now, a hollowed relic drifting silently in the expanse. But he wasn't leaving it just yet, not until he made things clear. The rescue team's signal crackled through the damaged comm system. This is Frontier Vessel Severance. Rylan Graves, we're locking onto your location. Prepare for extraction. Rylan pressed the comm button, his voice dry but firm. Hold your approach. I've got one last thing to do. On the screen in front of him, a prompt blinked, the last functional system Arcos had left behind. It was a final data upload, an archive of the ship's long, bloody history, fleet tactics, experimental protocols, and, most damning of all, evidence of the Union's monstrous desperation during the war. The truth. He hesitated, staring at the blinking cursor. This wasn't just history. This was ammunition, enough to topple the fragile alliances holding the frontier colonies together. If this information got out, the political fallout would make the Dominion's invasion look like a petty skirmish, yet to bury it would mean denying the truth, denying the sacrifices, the horror, and the lessons buried within this ghost ship. Rylan, the voice on the comm urged, sharper now. We're reading catastrophic failure in your location. You need to leave now. He let out a slow breath. Yeah. Keep your engines warm. I'm almost done. With a single keystroke, he initiated the upload, but instead of transmitting it to the Union's central command, he routed it to every independent colony across the sector. No censorship, no spin. Let the people see the truth and decide for themselves what it meant. The console flickered, the upload bar inching toward completion. He leaned back in the chair, watching as the history of the Resolute horizon poured out into the galaxy. For all its horrors, the ship wasn't just a relic of war. It was a reminder of how far desperation could push even the most righteous causes. A warning. The upload completed, the screen going dark, as the last spark of life drained from the ship. Rylan stood, his knees weak but steady enough. The Resolute horizon had given everything, and now it was his turn to walk away. The rescue pod docked moments later, the hatch hissing open to reveal a pair of grim-faced crew members. One of them, a wiry man with a stern expression, gestured for Rylan to hurry. Let's move. This whole place is falling apart. Rylan cast one last look at the empty command deck. For a moment, he imagined he could still hear Archos's voice, cold and sharp, guiding him through the chaos. He smirked. Thanks for the ride, you stubborn old bucket, he muttered, then turned and stepped into the pod. As the rescue ship pulled away, the Resolute horizon drifted silently into the void, its shattered hull glowing faintly in the distant light of the system's dying star. And then, with a final quiet burst, the ancient ship broke apart, scattering its fragments across the galaxy like ashes on the wind. On board the Severance, Rylan sat in silence as the rescue crew worked around him. The weight of what he'd done, what he'd unleashed, settled heavily on his shoulders, but for the first time, it felt like the right kind of weight, not a burden, but a balance. One of the crew members, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached him. You did good out there, Graves. Saved a lot of lives. He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, well, don't go nominating me for any medals. Pretty sure I just pissed off half the galaxy. She raised an eyebrow. You mean the upload? We caught it on the scanners. That's bold. Bold? Stupid. Take your pick. He glanced out the viewport, watching the last remnants of the Resolute horizon fade into the distance. But the way I see it, if people are going to fight, they ought to know what they're fighting for. The woman studied him for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Welcome back, Commander. Don't call me that, Rylan said, a tired grin creeping across his face. I'm officially retiring from galactic heroism. Next time the Dominion shows up, somebody else can play bait, she smirked. We'll see. As the Severance set course for the colonies, Rylan leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. For the first time in a long while, there was nothing left to do. No monsters to fight, no ancient ships to awaken. Just the quiet hum of the engines and the knowledge that, for better or worse, the truth was out there now. And as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, he thought of Arcos, of the ship, of the people who had fought and died aboard it. In the end, it hadn't been about the war, the Dominion, or even survival. It had been about choices, the ones that defined them and the ones that endured. The galaxy would remember the Resolute horizon, not as a weapon or a relic, but as a testament to the messy, complicated thing they called humanity. And for Rylan Graves, that was enough. The end.
Like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell. Your support means the world to me and helps me keep creating amazing content for you.